piece of shit motherfucker asshole.
Radio Free Ends Mickey episode 219 is death metal.
And he also likes K-pop too. So do I.
But yes, it is in fact a death metal week. And
제가 V앱을 너무 안 한다고.
what do you mean we can't monetize because we swore in the first 30 seconds? Okay, first of all, we're probably never going to be able to monetize this shit anyways. And second of all, I didn't swear, that was Thomas. And third of all, they ruined his Halloween.
그러니까 엄마 아빠가 그거를 해주면 이게 하드렌즈니.
Yeah, no, they really be doing that to a nigga out here. And I know how you feel about Halloween. But you know what won't ruin your Halloween? Some good old-fashioned death metal in, April or something. Only it's not quite that old-fashioned. I mean, it's from the 90s, and it's very old-school sounding, but the bands that we're going to be talking about today actually influenced quite a few modern styles of death metal, specifically a lot of the brutal death metal stuff and a lot of the slam stuff. Despite that, these bands aren't really brutal death metal or slam. They're just sort of presaging certain traits of those subgenres in a more old-school death metal format. Now, these kind of bands fall under the umbrella of what a lot of people like to call so stupid it's good death metal. And I used to say stuff like that, specifically about bands like Vomit Remnants. But then I started really thinking about it, and it's honestly kind of insulting. Because while these bands may use very simple ingredients in terms of like riffing style, the good bands that play this kind of stuff arrange those very simple riffs in very complex and interesting ways. It's not really that dumb. It just sounds stupid to stupid people, i.e. people that don't like death metal. The first of these bands is Baphomet from Buffalo, New York, not to be confused with Baphomet, the German thrash metal band, who were nowhere near as good.
Oh no!
Now there is something kind of confusing going on with these guys. You see, they sort of have two different versions of their debut album that are both completely different from each other, completely different recordings. They have a few of the same songs. One of them is called Inheritors of the Dead. The other one is called Dead Shall Inherit. Dead Shall Inherit is the one that everybody had back in the day. And by everyone, I mean people that had access to imported Peaceville CDs, because this was a Peaceville band, much like Vital Remains, active at the same time. But Dead Shall Inherit is like the actual debut album, but it comes out after this weird test pressing sort of fake debut album, Inheritors of the Dead. And speaking of stupid people, there seems to be a lot of talk running around the new old school death metal community of dumb hardcore kids that decided to start playing death metal because hardcore's boring, saying that this like test pressing sort of like false debut album, this Ralph McQuarrie concept art, if you will, is better than the actual officially released full length. And
No way.
I mean, there's not really anything wrong with the demo version of the album. I mean, it has a cool, dark, old-school death metal demo production. It shows off, like, the roots of their sounds, their influences, a little bit more than their later material, and it provides an interesting sort of academic study of the embryonic origins of their style, which is this push and pull between that sort of death grind shit you heard earlier and this more groove-influenced stuff that you're hearing right now. See, there's the grindcore stuff, and then it goes into a full stop choked off groove back into the grindcore stuff. It's these two opposing styles pushing and pulling against each other. And yeah, it's cool to hear the early version of that, but
Come on, man.
what we actually got on the proper official full length is a whole lot better. Because first off, the production on this album is perfect. It's like Scott Burns with actual balls. You can hear the bass, it's super thick, and the drums are perfect with all that reverb. And it lets them do cool stuff like this little full stop here. That's fucking heavy. Listen to that nasty guitar tone, dude. Don't worry, I'm going to get more to the songwriting later on. I'm not just going to gush over how great this album sounds, but it does sound great. And to pretend that somehow that wacky demo is like better because you're trying to get old school death metal clout, come on now. You're not fooling anybody. This album has better songs that aren't on that demo, and even the versions of songs from that demo that are on this album, they sound way better on the full length. There we go, back into the cool grindcore stuff. See, pushing and pulling between these like super slow groove metal riffs and super fast, nasty grindcore riffs. It's got impeccable songwriting. Watch this build up, dude. Really abrupt, terse, choked off death metal guitars. It's almost like the bass is the lead instrument here, and then it leads into this cool bit of textural composition where they really open up the guitar playing. This sort of playing around with rhythmic texture and this kind of layering, it's way more subtle than you would expect for the sort of like groovy caveman death metal. The production helps out with this by allowing you to determine the vicissitudes of each individual instrumental component. This part's cool because you have these darkly melodic sections that are separated by full stops. I mean, it's not mellow death, but it has sort of like a dark consonance to it. And this transition riff right here is sort of a clever inversion of the intro riff of the song. Sort of grindcoring it up. Before transitioning into more of kind of like a New York thrash style thing. In fact, this is probably the most New York death metal sounding band that does not end in Asian. With all of these chonky, sort of like New York hardcore style grooves that then lead back into the more grindcore-y things. But even these grindcore riffs build off of those like death metal riffs very effectively. And the melodic essences of each of those riffs can be shifted between this more hardcore inspired style and that more grindcore stuff very effectively, as you just heard. Back into that main riff from the song. It's a great fucking riff. It's a great fucking album. Go out and get it. Dead Shall Inherit. A lot of people nowadays might be familiar with these guys because Dying Fetus, a band who I don't really care for that much, but are definitely a big-ass band, covered them back on that covers album they did. And you could see how this sort of stuff would have influenced Slam Death a whole lot, even if what Baphomet plays isn't exactly standard modern-day Slam Death. Now, a lot of people will write this off as a one-album wonder because there's no other Baphomet albums. That's not entirely true. You might remember earlier I mentioned there was a German band called Baphomet that caused this band to change their name from Baphomet to Banished, who put out a follow-up to this album that not a whole lot of people were aware of because it was after Peaceville lost their US distribution for death metal albums. And this album is super interesting because there is a little bit of a style change. It's not like they sold out or anything. They did move a little bit away from that more grindcore-y / hardcore-y style New York death metal thing into something that almost sounds like a prequel to the Third Grave album that came out a year after this one. I say this partially because of that very buzzy guitar tone, partially because of the slight change in vocal style where he sounds a whole lot like Jorgen Sandstrom, which I appreciate because he's one of my favorite death metal vocalists, but most importantly because of the predominance of parts like this, where it really does sound like a death metal band doing their own reinterpretation of an early Prong song. This was a big component of the Third Grave album that I'm so fond of, and these guys did it first. Speaking of doing it first, how's this for a super duper early version of what we would come to know as a slam riff? Nice. And that same strong sense of rhythmic variation that was a big part of their first album. And they didn't let the grindcore go either. It's still there, dude. Honestly, I'm not sure which of these albums I like better. They both do the whole push and pull between the very fast parts and the very slow parts extremely well. They both hit very hard. I might like the slightly more cavernous production, the more old school sounding stuff on the first album, but the second Baphomet album, or the first Banished album, depending on how you look at it, that's not a slouch either. They're both great, and they're both very easy to get nowadays because Peaceville reissued them. And if that's not enough groove-oriented old-school US death metal for you, we got a whole other band here. Band by the name of Gutted. These guys are not from New York. They are from Toledo. And this band is made up entirely of brothers. Now, I'm not talking...
real brothers or street brothers?
I mean, this band has 3 dudes in it, and they're all siblings. 3 brothers, all with the last name of Ditch. Hopefully not related to, Andy. But if you liked the really long, atmospheric, groove-laden build-ups that you heard on the first Baphomet album, you are going to love Gutted's Bleed For Us To Live album. Because to that formula, they add some spooky keyboards and an even darker atmosphere. And an awesome production job that is very dark and thick, but also very audible and easy on the ears. As you can see, or hear rather, these guys are very adept at these sort of spooky build-ups. They start off with a super minimalist keyboard line, slowly add more and more elements, guitars, very thick bass vocals, before finally leading into a very powerfully grooving death metal riff with a whole lot of thrash elements to it. And one of the best bass guitar tones I've ever heard on a death metal album, right up there with Graves' Soulless and Seance's Salt Rubbed Eyes. Vocals are particularly of note because they bridge the gap between completely understandable and being really guttural and brutal sounding. There's that dramatic push-pull dynamic between faster riffs and slower choked-off grooves, And he even does a little bit of the old classic death metal trope of yelling "die," which is always appreciated. Cool little variation between riffs. They'll play them the same way a few different times. In this case, they've added some harmonic squeals like that one. This is one of those rare death metal albums that's actually incredibly catchy, and you can pretty much memorize where every song goes within one or two listens, despite the fact that the songs are all so long and involved, because they flow in such a logical manner. And the lead guitars are phenomenal. They're slightly melodic and consonant, but still have enough sort of like death metal grit and dissonance to them to maintain the atmosphere. Speaking of atmosphere, they got parts like this, the weird spooky narration, and the nasty vocal accents like that one. It all sounds very composed and very deliberate, and it kind of has its own sense of fun to it while not being overly silly. This approach extends to even the titling of songs. They have a song called Kickin' the Corpse. Not Kicking the Corpse, Kickin' apostrophe the Corpse. My personal favorite on the album is probably Chopped Up at the Altar though, which really shows off how impressive the bass playing is here. It's one of the standouts of the album for me. I really like how it kind of has this almost danceable cadence to it in the tradition of Carcass songs like Ruptured and Purulence and Corporal Jigsaw Quandary. These guys are really good at riding a groove for a while and keeping things interesting by slightly modifying guitar parts so it doesn't sound all too samey. But they also know how to abruptly transition into much more chaotic territory before pulling it back into the groove. And despite all these tempo changes, it never seems terribly spastic or weird on purpose. I feel like it would have been a really fun time seeing these guys live back in the day. Unfortunately, this is another case like Baphomet where they're sort of a one-album wonder. Sort of. Not exactly. You see, there is kind of a second Gutted album, but it's a weird one. Because the second half of it is literally just the demo they recorded before their first album, and then there's a Venom cover, and then there's a few new songs. So it's like full album length, but not really quite a full-length album. However, the new songs on this album are incredible. In fact, one of them is up there with one of my favorite death metal songs of all time. It is entitled Suffer in Exile. The production is also great this time around with a much coarser guitar tone. And then check out this little bit of variation. There's the main riff, and then here comes the variation counterpoint. See, that's clever. The songwriting is smart without being too show-offy or pretentious. In a way, it's rather subtle, which is not usually the sort of descriptor you would normally attach to a very groove-heavy death metal album, but there it is. Like, take this part right here. It's got a very tense riff with very rolling drum fills. You can tell they're building up to something. And what they're building up to is this downright lyrical sounding section where the keyboards kind of take over as the lead melodic instrument, the guitar is providing sort of a counterpoint to it, and those very understandable vocals appreciated as always from this vocalist. This then leads into a really cool groove riff, which is building up into one of my favorite sections of a song in all of death metal, right here. That lead guitar line is the best. And it gets even fucking cooler because watch what they do with it right here, man. It's sick. Okay, that is good stuff. I love that. Listen to those Dave Lombardo ride cymbal hits. So fucking good. And then the way they come out of it into the death metal groove. That is good stuff. I listen to this song at the gym quite a bit because it is amazing. And if you don't like it, fuck you! You know what I mean? And of course the lead guitar is amazing, just like it was in the prior album. Unfortunately, those two releases are all that we got from Gutted, but between that and all that great Baphomet/Banish stuff that we played this episode, that's 4 amazing death metal albums. That should hold you over. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.
Gotta get going, so bye. Bye.